Hello and welcome to the Writing Center's workshop on peer review. While this workshop is primarily for instructors, the workshop can also be used by students if they'd like to review some of the protocol and strategies that they can use when working with students on peer review. First, there's an importance for preparing for peer review. A lot of times as instructors, we might just inherently know what peer review is and assume that students also will follow these best practices when conducting peer review, but research and experience has shown that students often need to have a bit of preparation by both instructors and students. So some of the preparation that instructors can do initially is to provide students with a rubric to follow during peer review. Using the rubric that will be used for the paper itself is a really good approach so that students can begin to explore and understand the importance and the purpose of the rubric and what the assignment is asking them to accomplish. It also helps students to understand what is expected of them in terms of writing preparation, and it helps them to think about peer review feedback and behavior. That's one that is professional and one that is a reader response rather than some type of evaluation. Another good approach for preparation is providing students examples of excellent papers of the paper that they might be writing as guidelines if possible. Some instructors like to provide A papers so that students can see explicitly what the student did right or wrong. I myself tend to like to provide students papers that are in draft form that have a lot of things going well, but maybe some things are like missing the mark a little bit, and then allowing students to review those student examples and then talk about what they see is working and what's not working, and to have a conversation about that in relationship to the assignment outcomes and objectives and the rubric itself. And also, it might be nice to have a checklist for students to look at. Sometimes they might be unsure or unaware of what they should be focusing on, so having some key bullet points to remind them what they should be focusing on when they're providing feedback in the peer review is very helpful for students. Also, it's very important to help students understand the type of responses that they should be giving to their peers and the purpose of a peer review. So purposes of peer review, because the paper is in draft form, should not be one that is looking at low order concerns such as editing, sentence level particularly, but rather high order concerns that students can use to continue to revise and develop their writing. And so often these high order concerns will focus on the argument or thesis statement, the organization of the writing, paragraph structure. I like to have students look at paragraph structure, often asking them to highlight the paragraphs in colors. So for instance, if the paragraph is supposed to look at a particular topic or idea, that idea would be highlighted in blue, and any different or new idea would be highlighted in a different color. This works really well because it helps students to visually see how their paragraph is or is not focusing on one main point, and it also helps them to see the information that they need to move particularly out to a different paragraph. They can also look at the conciseness of writing, the analysis or synthesis of the research that they're conducting, the use of the lexis and tone of voice if it's appropriate to the topic and to the audience and to the purpose of the assignment, and certainly the use of sources and integration of sources so that students are representing the research that they've conducted. If you do provide a rubric for students to use as criteria for commentary or key main points, have students maybe think about providing more than 8 main comments on the peer review. A lot of research out there suggests, especially when students are revising, that providing too much feedback can be overwhelming. And also, I like to suggest that the comments focus on particular aspects of the paper, not all of the aspects that could be examined. So I like to highlight and show to students how looking over a paper and coming up with maybe 2 or 3 main areas of concern and making those comments focus on those 3 areas of concern rather than all the things that you see going on because that becomes, again, overwhelming. And if the paper is in a draft form, you can always revisit the other aspects. So kind of figuring out what are the top 3 or the top 2 areas that a student can look at and start to revise is very useful for students. It's also important for students to make sure that their comments are focused on the grading criteria. So the main components of the essay, the rubric itself, is going to be useful for them as guidelines for that. Also using open-ended questions instead of yes or no. So it's not very useful for a student to receive feedback that says there's no thesis statement here. More useful would be to say, I see in your essay that you're talking about A, B, and C, and yet I only see A in your thesis. Maybe it would be a good idea to include the other 2 categories that you're exploring in your paper in your thesis. That's useful, that's helpful. They have kind of like a roadmap or guideline for revision rather than being like, great, I have no thesis, now what do I do? And also it's very useful to help participants when you develop assessment criteria. One thing I like to do, takes a little bit of work, but it works very well, I think, in the long run, is having students develop a rubric for the assignment that allows them to look over the assignment, the criteria and objectives, and to determine what is important in regard to the essay that they're writing, and to come up with a agreed upon rubric that matches that essay's purpose and what should be within that essay. They then have a much less abstract idea of what's expected of them. And it's also nice to be able to say to the students, you created this, this is the rubric that's being used. There should be no disagreements in regard to the rubric itself at this point, right? All right, so when you begin to implement peer review, in order to have effective peer review, students should be able to be willing to participate. And usually they're more willing if it's done in class, although peer review can happen outside of class. And again, we do have online courses at Wayne State, and so sometimes this is difficult, but sometimes that can be done still in a kind of online discussion board where all students are still engaging in that way and the instructor is there, but they're more likely to participate and revise if they're working in class. And also it's very useful if students can revise in documents that are cloud-based so that they can see the comments, the revisions, and access them rather than having it maybe in just a paper form. There's different ways to create peer groups. Usually the best amount of numbers at most is 5, and that just depends also on the time that you have and how many papers you want your students to review. It allows for students to discuss and even disagree without a large imbalance of power in the group. There's not so many people that nobody gets a chance to talk. Now there's 3 different types of groups that you can do. I mean, there's more than these 3, but these 3 tend to be the most typical. You can do the first, which is maintaining the same writing group throughout the semester. This is very useful when you know that you have a group of students that tend to be maybe not as collaborative when they're doing group work. They may not be as outspoken in class. They might seem to be a little bit shy. And so then it allows students to feel less insecure and become more comfortable with their group and establish a rapport with each other, which is really important when you're sharing your writing and working with students and providing feedback. There are risks in that it might make students feel bad about providing constructive criticism because they have gotten to know each other, and then therefore they may not want to hurt someone's feelings. And so that's why the preparation portion of the peer review is really useful. Another is switching writing groups for each paper. This does help with students feeling less concerned with hurting others' feelings because they're constantly working with other students, but then again it might hinder certain students who are shy or uncomfortable with sharing or participating to engage fully within the peer review activity. Or you can give each group a different group's paper, and in that way, you're kind of encouraging honest feedback and stronger group discussion because now it's no longer about anybody who's in that group, but rather somebody who's looking at another group's paper. I do think that this is a group that works best once you've started to establish peer review strategies and protocol. And also, it's important to remind the group that they should respond in the way that they would like to have others respond. And that doesn't mean necessarily everything's great and this is working well, but in a very respectful, very helpful manner, rather than being like this overarching critique, which could sometimes happen in these types of groups. And the instructor's role for peer review is very important to monitor and coach during the reviews, where you circulate, provide feedback, see what's going on, asking questions, making sure that you examine the quality of peer feedback. I typically have the students provide to me the peer review feedback they provided to their peers as a grade. Very small points, but they will submit to me in Canvas or whatever platform it is the feedback that they've provided. And so that gives me an insight into what they're providing. It allows me to see whether or not I need to maybe revise or revisit some of the instruction for peer review. And it helps me to moderate the reliability and validity of feedback and see if it's being useful and if it's something that's working for the students. So like I said, grading peer review is a very strong incentive. I don't think it needs to have a lot of points, but it shows that this is something that has importance to it. And then making sure there's a specific time frame for the review. Like I said, it's usually nice to do it in class, but it's also very important to give time to students for them to be able to read, to digest, and to provide feedback. And so I find that in classes, more than 3 papers for students to look over, that just becomes unwieldy and they don't have enough time to do the adequate feedback that they should be providing. For the students should both review in writing and by verbal feedback. Writing is great, but it's really important for students to be able to provide the feedback and then have a conversation with their peers, so then they may be able to get some insight into what the student was trying to do or what they were thinking. Oftentimes, we have assumptions about what a student is attempting to accomplish or what they're attempting to write or their goals for their paper, and that may not be the case. And so having that feedback is really important in verbal communication. There should be questions for the reviewers as well, where you kind of have reader-based. What are your reactions? What are your emotions? What are your responses to this paper? And also ones that are criterion-based when it comes to like the rubric and so forth. So it gives them a nice mix when they're looking at the feedback to try to revise their paper. Editing is really not a great tool, and I think a lot of students think that that is the role of peer review. It does little to teach students, doesn't really address higher order concerns, and edits are often going to be, not useful because we're assuming that this is going to be an essay or piece of writing that's going to be revised regardless, and so going into those like low order concerns at this moment is counterproductive, and therefore grammar instruction and so forth is not very useful at this point either. All right, so that's kind of our overview of peer review. If you would like any further ideas or even examples of how peer review is conducted in classrooms, you can reach out to the Writing Center. We do have some examples. I have examples. And I know a bunch of colleagues that would be more than happy to share some of their approaches or examples of effective peer review in the classroom. And again, we are very happy to have you use this information when developing and creating peer review in your classroom. And certainly we're very happy to work with students and instructors during the peer review process and provide any type of resources that you might need. And so, as I said, please reach out to the Writing Center. Students can come and visit us. Instructors can ask for us to present workshops or provide online workshops regarding peer review. And so we're definitely here to help. Thank you so much for watching. And as I said, we hope to work with you and your students in the future, and we hope that this was useful for you.